Mureck, Austria, 1998, round 5 of the European Chess Championship for boys under 16. I had white against Dmitry Batsanin, an international master from Russia. Back then I was eager to play attacking, exciting chess, the kind that the isolated queen-pawn formation often leads to. And it had always been one of my favorite setups, until this game. I started with d4, c4 and knight f3, inviting the Bogu Indian, or perhaps guiding my opponent towards the queen's gambit. But I went for the Benoni with c5. And again I tried to steer the game back to the queen's gambit territory, which has been finally accepted. We ended up with this tension in the center that usually leads to an isolated queen's pawn. Only question is, who's going to end up with it? Now, with this in mind, my move a3 makes more sense. The plan is to take on c5, then push b4 to gain a tempo on the bishop. And basically, white is pushing black to take on d4. This means white will end up with an IQP. And after waiting for the light square bishop to develop, black eventually takes on c4. Both sides castle, and in our game, black followed up with b6. Well, now we have a typical IQP position. The d4 pawn might be a weakness, but it also gives white space, more active pieces, and better attacking chances. Now, if black manages to survive the attack, though, this pawn becomes a problem in the endgame. That's why in middle games like this, white aims to attack and keep pieces on the board, while black looks to trade and steer towards an endgame. Along with the attacking idea, white might also look to get rid of their isolated pawn by pushing it to d5. And this means the endgame won't be bad for white, though they'll lose their space advantage. Still, it's a valuable option because after all the exchanges on d5, white usually ends up with a centralized piece, for a moment at least, and that alone can give them a slight edge. What I had in mind here is the ideal setup for white. One rook on e1, the other one on d1, a bishop on g5, and the other one on a2 or b1, depending on the plan. If white wants to push d5, well then of course the bishop belongs on a2. And if the goal is to attack the enemy king, then the queen and bishop battery along the b1 h7 diagonal works better. And the queen's placement follows the same logic, either e2 or d3. But sometimes the queen doesn't really have a choice, especially when the d4 pawn is under huge pressure, like it is in this case. It's worth mentioning that the f3 knight typically goes to e5, which is treated almost as an outpost. And this also helps one of the rooks lift and swing to the king's side, increasing the pressure on the enemy king. Now, looking at the position, we can see that white has at least 3 solid moves, all part of the overall plan. There is bishop g5, rook e1, and queen d3, which is the move playing the game. We had bishop b7, and then bishop g5. A move that I'm not really a big fan of, because it's really just there to help the a1 rook get to d1 and nothing else. The downside is that the same bishop becomes vulnerable, possible trade offers, like with knight d5, either now or in a few moves. For that reason, many top players prefer to bring the f-rook to d1, leaving the queenside rook out of play, of course. Now, I didn't want to take that route, and basically I tried to trick my opponent into letting me build the perfect setup. What I forgot, though, is that in those Russian chess schools, They studied these IQP positions more than anything else, and that my opponent wasn't about to just sit back. We had rook c8, rook a d1, and then here it is, knight to d5. Now two of our miners are under threat, and we cannot let them be traded off without getting something in return. I was considering taking on d5, but I couldn't quite figure out what would happen after e takes d, bishop takes e7, and d takes c4. Obviously bishop takes d8, and then c takes d3. Now, when black keeps pushing for these exchanges, white is usually looking for a chance to create a weakness in black's camp. An IQP as well, or to advance d5 if possible. And the best move here for white was to take on d5, but with the bishop. You'll see the idea. If e takes d5, then bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, and rook fe1, with a slight advantage for white due to black's weak bishop. And if black instead takes on g5, well, white can play bishop e4 with the idea of pushing d5 next. Although it's not completely clear what happens if black pushes f5 at this point. There is actually a game between Boris Spassky and Anatoly Banik where Spassky took on c6 here, and after rook takes c6, rook fe1, bishop to f6, he managed to push d5, but it didn't look like he gained much. The game ended in a draw, by the way. I moved the bishop back to d2, which is a pretty weird spot for it. I immediately felt like something is wrong, but I couldn't really figure out how to exploit it from my opponent's perspective. Dmitry took on c3, and after bishop takes c3, he hit me with knight a5. Totally missed that one. It messes up everything I was trying to do. If I take on a5, there is bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and rook c4. And just check out how bad this position is for white. All the minor pieces are off the board except the dark square bishop, which is stuck defending that weak pawn on d4, while black's bishop is about to become a perfect attacker. I decided to pull the bishop back to a2, but then bishop d5, another move from black aiming to trade pieces and head into an endgame. It's better for them, of course. I moved the bishop again, but at this point the light squares are completely gone, and my dark square bishop is basically just a big pawn now. After g6, rook fe1 and knight c4, I moved to e5, hoping my opponent would fix my pawn structure. But of course that didn't happen. They came up with this nice move, queen c7, eyeing the a3 pawn because of the c3 bishop hanging at the end. It also sets up rook fd8. At this point, I saw an idea to sacrifice the d4 pawn and give my bishop on c3 another life. But black shut down that right away with bishop back to d5. Now we both have a pair of bishops, which is pretty sad when you have an isolated queen's pawn. Because without the knights, there is no real way to even make use of the e5 square anymore. I decided to go for this because I saw my queen was getting really close, and I just needed a rook on the h file for a checkmate. I figured that the a3 pawn was indirectly protected, because if they took it, I could lift the rook, and by doing so I'm defending the c3 bishop and basically creating a double threat. But my opponent saw it all better than me, and it turns out I blundered. Now you can pause the video and try to figure it out for yourself. I blundered because I didn't realize they could just take the pawn for free. And after rook d3, pull the bishop back to d6. And after rook h3, simple move f5 completely secures their king. So position is already lost for white. Only two pieces are part of the attack. The b1 bishop is completely useless, and the other one is not clear how to coordinate with. Meanwhile, black is up a pawn, fully centralized, with pieces working well together, and there are practically no weaknesses. We got rook f7, then bishop g5 and queen b7. Very nice move. I didn't like to see it in the game, but it's really clever, trying to get f3 in so that the h3 rook would be taken out of play. Now, realizing that the attack was pretty much over, I moved my rook to e3, putting pressure on the backward e6 pawn. But then came another brilliant combo. Bishop f8, queen h4, and h6. The idea is after bishop f4 to play g5, and after queen g3, just something to g7, unpinning and leaving white with a ton of problems. Because black isn't done with the forks yet. After queen h3, f takes e3, f takes c, rook e7, queen h5, and bishop e4, black is up a full rook, and that's pretty much game over. This game shows what the ideal setup with an IQP looks like, though we'll need another video to explain why it's so strong. It also demonstrates how tricky it can be when you're left with only bishops in an IQP position. We saw how an attack with a queen and a lifted rook doesn't have to be too dangerous, especially when most of the other pieces aren't involved. And finally, it highlights that knowing the ideal setup is valuable, but it's not something that always happens or is even possible to achieve, especially when you're up against a strong opponent.